Good evening. Tonight we're stepping into a space that most people never even realize exists. The air feels different here, doesn't it? Like the quiet hum before a storm. And here's the unsettling truth. You probably wouldn't survive this, because what I'm about to reveal is not for the faint-hearted, not for those who cling to comfort, and certainly not for anyone satisfied with shallow answers. It's for the few, those who have sensed, even in silence, that they don't belong to the ordinary patterns of life. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you are right now, your location, your time of day. I want to know what corner of the world my voice is reaching, what places my words might echo through tonight. Now, turn off the lights, maybe switch on a fan for some soft background noise, and let's begin tonight's journey together. For as long as I can remember, I've carried this odd awareness that my mind didn't move the way others seemed to. It wasn't arrogance, more like a quiet suspicion that I was either missing something everyone else had, or holding something everyone else couldn't see. Jung described this feeling as the hallmark of differentiated consciousness, a rare psychological architecture that fewer than 5% of people ever develop. Imagine living decades thinking you're broken, only to discover that what you've mistaken for damage is actually an upgrade. I felt that every classroom I sat in as a child, every group of friends I tried to blend into, there was always this nagging sense that I was playing along with a game I hadn't agreed to. Everyone else seemed satisfied with surface-level answers, happy to laugh at rehearsed jokes, eager to nod when the teacher spoke. I couldn't. My mind went digging where others skimmed. Why do we need this rule? Why does that belief matter? What happens if we stop pretending? The questions swirled, and instead of being celebrated, they earned me silence, sometimes discomfort, and often disapproval. That was my first glimpse of rarity, not in some glamorous flash of genius, but in the loneliness of realizing that my natural way of being was unwelcome in ordinary spaces. Old age wisdom says that the nail that sticks out gets hammered down, and I felt hammered often. Yet with hindsight, I see that it was never about being wrong. It was about being rare. Here's the quirky fact that makes me laugh now. Flamingos are actually born gray. Their iconic pink color only comes from the food they eat. In other words, they are forced to look like everyone expects because of constant consumption. For much of my early life, I felt like that gray flamingo being force-fed pink dye, expected to smile, to tone myself down, to take in all the expectations of others until I matched their picture of normal. But beneath it all, my natural color was something else entirely. Academically, Jung would have said this was the beginning of individuation, the slow, painful dawning that the persona, the mask I wore to fit in, was not the whole of me. And here's the publicly debatable bit. Some argue that such feelings are just signs of alienation in modern society, not evidence of any advanced psychological state. But I think Jung was right, because when you sit with this dissonance long enough, something extraordinary happens. You start to notice patterns in yourself and in others that most people can't even name. That was my awakening to rarity, not a grand moment of revelation, but the steady, uncomfortable ache of living slightly out of tune with the chorus. Everyone else seemed to sing in harmony, and though it felt like exile at the time, I see now it was the first signal of something profound, that my consciousness was moving on a different track, one Jung would have recognized as rare and evolutionarily advanced. The first sign of a rare personality type is simply this: the realization that you are different, and the courage to stop mistaking that difference for a defect. The second sign emerged long before I had words to describe it. It was the emotional depth, the way feelings didn't just touch me but seemed to carve their initials into my very bones. I would watch others shrug off an argument, brush away disappointment, or laugh off betrayal, while I carried these things like heavy stones in my pocket. Jung called these experiences affect-tone complexes, emotional imprints that root themselves deep within the psyche and ripple outward long after the initial moment has passed. For me, sadness wasn't a passing cloud. It was a thunderstorm with an orchestra of violins swelling in the background. Joy wasn't a smile and a laugh. It was an electric current running through my chest, sparking light behind my eyes. Anger wasn't a quick flare, it was molten lava, burning in silence until it cooled into hardened rock. Everything was amplified, magnified, sometimes unbearable, and yet strangely beautiful. People often told me I was too sensitive. You've probably heard that phrase before. It's usually delivered like an accusation, as though sensitivity were a crime or a weakness. And for a while, I believed them. I thought my intensity made me fragile, unstable, even broken. But Jung would have disagreed. He believed this level of emotional resonance was not a flaw, but a sign of psychological sophistication, proof that the psyche was tuned into layers of reality others couldn't access. Here's a quirky fact. Scientists have discovered that octopuses have more neurons in their tentacles than most creatures do in their brains. Each arm is capable of independent thought, sensation, and decision-making. Living with my depth of emotion often felt like being an octopus of the heart, each feeling stretching out like a limb, touching the world, pulling in signals, wrapping around experiences I couldn't ignore. Exhausting. Absolutely. But it also meant I could grasp dimensions of human experience that slipped right past others. Now, old age wisdom says, still waters run deep. And I can tell you, that saying is truer than most people realize. Stillness on the surface often hides a churning ocean beneath. My calm face in moments of chaos wasn't detachment. It was containment. A practiced ability to hold a flood inside without drowning those around me. That was my gift and my curse. Feeling the entire weight of an ocean in spaces where others skimmed only the surface. Of course, not everyone sees it that way. The academically debatable point is whether emotional intensity is strength or dysfunction. Some argue that it leads to anxiety, depression, and maladaptation. And yes, if you've lived with it, you know how overwhelming it can be. But Jung offered another perspective, that such intensity is the very material from which individuation is forged. The ability to descend into feeling, no matter how dark, is the same ability that allows transformation, growth, and wisdom. Without depth, there is no foundation. Without storms, there is no cleansing. I used to envy those who could brush things off. I thought life must be easier without carrying the weight of every emotion. But over time, I realized my depth was what made me human in the truest sense. It gave me the capacity to connect, to understand, to empathize at levels that defy logic. It allowed me to sense what others left unspoken, to mourn what others hadn't noticed, and to love with a ferocity that sometimes scared even me. This was the second sign of rarity, emotions that don't merely color life, but orchestrate it, feelings that arrive not as passing moods, but as symphonies, demanding to be felt, honored, and integrated. If you've ever cried at the way sunlight filters through trees, or felt heartbreak from watching a stranger's silent sorrow, then you know what I mean? You are not fragile. You are finely tuned. And though society may call it too much, Jung would say it is exactly enough. More than enough. It is the rare gift of emotional sophistication, and once embraced, it transforms not only how you feel, but how you live. The third sign of rarity is what I call the burden of sacred curiosity. For as long as I've been alive, I have never been able to leave a question unanswered, not because the answer was always useful, but because not knowing gnawed at me like an itch I couldn't scratch. Jung understood this as the transcendent function, that relentless psychological urge to dig beneath appearances, to refuse surface explanations, and to reach toward meanings most people don't even realize exist. I remember sitting in classrooms while everyone else dutifully copied notes, and I would raise my hand to ask, "But why does it matter?" The teachers frowned, the students groaned, and I felt that peculiar sting of being treated like a disruption simply because I wanted to go deeper. This wasn't rebellion. It wasn't attention-seeking. It was survival. My mind couldn't rest until it had tugged at every loose thread, and sometimes, pulling at one thread unraveled the entire fabric of what people believed was true. That's why curiosity can feel like both a gift and a curse. It awakens you, but it unsettles everyone else. Old age wisdom says, curiosity killed the cat. But the second half of the saying, satisfaction brought it back, is the part people conveniently forget. Yes, curiosity has cost me comfort, belonging, even relationships. But every time I found an answer, every time I peeled back a layer, I came back stronger, sharper, more alive. I didn't die from curiosity. I was reborn through it. Here's a quirky fact. Lobsters never stop growing. Unlike humans who peak and plateau, lobsters shed their shells and expand throughout their lives. That's exactly how sacred curiosity feels. Each time I discover something new, My old shell cracks, and I'm forced to grow into a larger one. The process is uncomfortable, even painful, but the alternative, staying trapped in an old shell, would suffocate me. Of course, there's a publicly debatable dimension here. Some academics argue that relentless questioning is a symptom of dissatisfaction, or even pathology, that people like me are incapable of contentment. Maybe they're right in part, but Jung would argue that it's not dissatisfaction, it's evolution. Curiosity is the psyche's way of refusing stagnation. The world progresses not because people accept what they're told, but because a few strange souls keep asking, why? Sacred curiosity means I can't sit comfortably in illusions. When a friend insists they're happy, but their eyes flicker with sorrow, I want to know what story lies beneath. When society praises a system that clearly exploits the vulnerable, I can't help but question the morality beneath the numbers. When I'm told to accept shallow truths for the sake of peace, my mind rebels. That rebellion is not against authority. It's against unconsciousness. But here's the heavy part. Living with this trait means living with tension. Most people don't want their illusions dismantled. They prefer the comfort of easy answers over the discomfort of deep truth. And when you insist on asking questions they don't want to face, they turn their frustration on you. You become the difficult one, the intense one, the one who overthinks. They don't see that your curiosity isn't an attack, it's an invitation to awaken. And yet, the burden of sacred curiosity is also the beauty of it. Because in those rare moments when you meet someone who can sit with your questions, who doesn't flinch when you probe the edges of reality, the connection is electric. Two minds lighting up in unison, exploring paths no one else dares to tread. That is the reward. That is the proof that curiosity is not destruction, but creation. This is the third sign of rarity, living with a mind that refuses to stop asking why. Even when the answers cost you comfort, it is a burden. Yes, but also a privilege. Because curiosity is not the enemy of peace. It is the midwife of truth. And I have learned, sometimes the hard way, that a life without truth is not worth living. The fourth sign of rarity is the gift and the burden of what I call hyper-alive awareness. Jung identified intuition as a legitimate psychological function. Not just a mystical trait, but a way of perceiving reality through the unconscious, drawing patterns from the smallest of signals. For me, it has always felt like living with antennae no one else can see. I don't just hear words, I hear what hangs between them. I don't just notice faces, I catch the twitch at the corner of the mouth, the flicker in the eyes, the way silence can be louder than speech. When someone tells me they're fine, I feel the lie hum through my bones before their lips have even closed. It isn't magic. It isn't paranoia. It's a nervous system tuned so finely that even the smallest tremor in another person registers as a quake in my own. And while others stroll through a conversation, I often feel like I'm navigating a minefield of unspoken truths and hidden emotions. Old age wisdom says, the devil is in the details. And perhaps that's true. I see the details most people overlook. A mismatched tone of voice, a gesture out of sync with the story, the sudden tightening of a jaw. These tiny fragments assemble themselves into patterns. And suddenly I know far more about a person than they ever intended to reveal. Sometimes it feels like a blessing. Sometimes, honestly, it feels like trespassing. Here's a quirky fact. Bees can detect the electric fields of flowers, sensing charges invisible to human eyes. That's how they know which blossoms still hold nectar. Living with hyper-awareness is like being a human bee. You sense the invisible currents beneath people, environments, and even events. You know when something is nourishing and when it's barren. But unlike bees, who happily fly off to the next flower, I've often found myself stuck, compelled to engage with what I've already seen, even when I wish I hadn't. Academically, this sensitivity is debatable. Some scholars argue it's simply heightened empathy or even a manifestation of anxiety. Perhaps they're partly right, but Jung's framing resonates more deeply. He saw this as evidence of an active unconscious, pushing perception beyond the obvious, granting glimpses into the psyche's hidden terrain, where others see only surfaces. I see undercurrents, where others hear only words. I hear the echoes of the soul, but here lies the danger. Hyper-awareness can exhaust you. Imagine being the unofficial therapist in every room, constantly monitoring the emotional climate, regulating tensions, preempting explosions. You become the one who steps in with a joke before the argument starts, the one who adjusts your tone to calm the rising storm, the one who notices the one person left out and quietly brings them back in. You become indispensable and invisible, because while everyone benefits from your awareness, few even notice it's happening. I've learned the hard way that if you don't set boundaries, hyper-awareness becomes a leash others will happily hold. They will lean on you to carry the emotional weight of every situation, and you will burn out. Jung warned that without shadow integration, gifts like these collapse under their own weight. Awareness without boundaries becomes torment. You don't just see too much, you feel responsible for too much. Still, there is beauty here too. This awareness has given me the ability to create spaces where others feel profoundly seen. When I look at someone and mirror back not their words, but their unspoken truth, I watch walls crumble. People cry, laugh, confess. They feel safe because someone has finally noticed them without judgment. That is the alchemy of hyper-awareness. The ability to transform isolation into connection with a single look, a single acknowledgement. This is the fourth sign of rarity. The capacity to perceive what others miss, to live with antennae that never switch off. It is exhausting, yes, but it is also extraordinary. Because in a world obsessed with appearances, to see beneath the surface is nothing less than revolutionary. The fifth sign of rarity is the relentless craving for meaning. Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." For me, that line has never felt like philosophy. It has felt like necessity. My psyche doesn't allow me to coast on autopilot. I can't just accept a job because it pays well, or pursue a relationship because it looks good on paper, or smile through conversations that skim the surface like pebbles skipping across water. If life doesn't hold meaning, my soul rebels. I've tried, believe me, I've tried living the so-called normal way. I've taken the jobs that promised stability, said yes to roles that gave me approval, surrounded myself with people who expected me to fit a template. And on the outside, it looked fine. But inside, there was a gnawing emptiness. That's the thing about a psyche wired for meaning. It won't be fooled. It won't accept substitutes. It won't let you sleep peacefully when you're betraying yourself. Old age wisdom says, "Better bread with water than cake with deceit." And I've found that to be true. I'd rather have a simple life aligned with truth than a gilded cage lined with applause. Because applause fades. Applause is addictive but hollow. But meaning, that sustains. Meaning fills the cracks in the soul, like gold in Japanese kintsugi pottery, turning brokenness into beauty. Here's a quirky fact. Monarch butterflies migrate thousands of miles every year. Guided by instincts scientists still don't fully understand. No map, no GPS, no teacher, and yet they find their way to the exact same forests. That's how my craving for meaning feels. No matter how far I wander into distractions, some deep instinct always pushes me back toward the forests of authenticity. Even if I don't have the full map, I know when I'm off course. This, of course, raises an academic debate. Some argue that craving meaning is a luxury, a byproduct of privilege, that most of humanity is too busy surviving to chase fulfillment. There's truth in that. But Jung would argue that the absence of meaning is itself a kind of death. He observed that people who live against their true type often develop neuroses, not because they lack resources, but because they lack alignment. Meaning isn't optional for the rare psyche, it's oxygen. Without it, everything else collapses. I've noticed how this trait reshapes relationships. Shallow connections feel unbearable, not because the people are unworthy, but because my spirit suffocates in conversations that never go deeper than weather and gossip. I don't want to know what you did yesterday. I want to know why you dream what you dream. I don't care about your job title. I care about what breaks your heart and what sets your soul alight. That craving for depth has ended friendships, sometimes painfully, but it has also led me to the kind of connections that feel like homecoming, where two souls recognize each other beyond words. And here is the reflection I keep returning to. A life without meaning might be easier, but it isn't living. Meaning demands sacrifice of comfort, of conformity, of illusion. But what it gives in return is worth everything. A sense of being truly alive, even in struggle, even in uncertainty. Jung was right. This craving isn't about luxury. It's about becoming who you truly are. And the price of ignoring it is higher than the price of pursuing it. This is the fifth sign of rarity, an insatiable demand for meaning over comfort. Depth over surface, authenticity over applause. It makes life harder. Yes, but it also makes life worth living. Because when you find meaning, even in the smallest things, you no longer feel like you're surviving. You feel like you're becoming. The sixth sign of rarity is the pattern of outgrowing people and environments again and again. Jung spoke of psychological death and rebirth, the continual process of shedding old skins so that the psyche can grow into its next form. For me, this has been less of a choice and more of an inevitability. Just when I begin to feel comfortable, something within me shifts, and suddenly the places, the conversations, even the relationships that once felt alive now feel suffocating. It isn't arrogance. It isn't about thinking I'm better than others. It's about alignment. I've always felt like a tree that can't help but push its roots deeper and its branches higher. And sometimes, the soil that once nourished me can no longer sustain the new growth. Old age wisdom says, you cannot step into the same river twice. And it's true, the river keeps moving. And so do we. But I think for rare personalities, the current runs faster. What others take decades to shed, I seem to outgrow in months or years. Here's a quirky fact. Snakes shed their skin up to 4 times a year. Depending on how fast they're growing, the shedding isn't comfortable, it's itchy, vulnerable, sometimes even dangerous. But without it, they'd die. That's how my outgrowing has felt. Painful, messy, misunderstood, but absolutely necessary. This trait sparks one of the most publicly debatable questions in psychology. Is constant growth healthy, or is it a form of restlessness? Even avoidance. Some argue that people like me never learn to be satisfied, that we sabotage stability by always seeking the next evolution. Perhaps there's truth in that critique. But Jung's perspective reframes it. He would say that psychological evolution is not restlessness. It is the psyche's demand for authenticity. Once an environment no longer supports your wholeness, remaining in it is a form of unconscious self-betrayal. I've lived the heartbreak of this pattern. Friends who knew me in my people-pleasing years sometimes look at me now and wonder what happened. They miss the agreeable version of me, the one who laughed at jokes that weren't funny, the one who stayed silent rather than risk discomfort. And when I no longer fit that mold, they retreat. I can't blame them. They're clinging to a memory, while I'm compelled to inhabit a new self. The strangest part is how the cycle repeats. Just when I think I've finally arrived, I wake up one morning and realize I've grown again. The job that once inspired me now feels stale. The city that once thrilled me now feels like a cage. The relationship that once felt expansive now feels tight. And then I face the choice again. Shrink back into comfort, or step into the unknown and honor the new skin I'm growing. This is the sixth sign of rarity, to outgrow again and again. Not because you want to, but because you must. It's lonely. Yes, it's exhausting. Yes, but it's also proof that you are alive in the deepest sense. You are not frozen in an old identity. You are willing to die and be reborn, over and over, until what remains is nothing but truth. The seventh sign of rarity is the ability to create what I call transformational presence. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. For most people, this is an occasional occurrence. But for me, it has become a pattern. People tell me again and again. I don't know why I'm saying this, but I've never told anyone before. It's as if simply standing in my presence unlocks something in them, as though some hidden door swings open, and suddenly the truth comes spilling out. I never trained for this. I never asked for it. Yet somehow, I've become the person who holds space for confessions, heartbreaks, hidden dreams, and unspeakable fears. Old age wisdom says, a burden shared is a burden halved, and I've lived this countless times, watching the relief in someone's eyes after they release a secret they've carried for years. But here's the irony. While I often feel honored, I also feel drained, because transformation is not free. Presence demands energy, and when you give it freely to everyone, you risk burning out without anyone noticing. Here's a quirky fact. In physics, there's a phenomenon called quantum entanglement, where two particles remain mysteriously connected, instantly affecting each other regardless of distance. My presence often feels like that. I entangle with people, even briefly, and something shifts in them. But the entanglement goes both ways. Their emotions, their pain, Their intensity flow into me as much as mine flows into them. That's the invisible exchange of being deeply present. You can't help but take some of what you hold. Academically, this quality raises a fierce debate. Some argue that transformational presence is just projection, that people project their longing for safety onto whoever feels trustworthy. Others insist it's a learned therapeutic skill, not an innate gift. Jung, however, saw it differently. He called it creating psychological holding space, the ability to become a container for another's truth without judgment. He understood that certain individuals naturally radiate this capacity, often because they have walked through their own shadows and returned intact. In essence, those who have carried their own darkness are less frightened of carrying yours. For me, this presence has been both blessing and curse. I've lost count of the number of times someone has sat across from me, begun with small talk, and within minutes found themselves weeping, or the times when silence stretched between us, not awkward but fertile, and suddenly they blurted out the very thing they swore they'd never admit. It happens in cafes, in offices, on late-night walks. It even happens with strangers on trains. They sense, perhaps unconsciously, that my presence can absorb what they've been too afraid to release. But here's the reflection that matters most. I've learned that presence is powerful, but it must be protected. I used to think I had to hold everyone's pain, as though my worth was measured by how much I could absorb. But Jung warned about helper syndrome, the unconscious self-sacrifice that leaves the healer hollow. The truth is, presence without boundaries isn't generosity, it's martyrdom. And martyrdom helps no one in the long run. This is the seventh sign of rarity, the gift of transformational presence, the ability to unlock hidden truths and create space where others feel profoundly seen. It is a gift, yes, but one that demands discernment, because while presence can heal, it can also consume, and the rare psyche must learn to balance both. The eighth sign of rarity is the persistent sense of an undefined purpose, the strange inner calling that whispers at all hours. Jung said, "Your vision becomes clear when you look into your heart. Who looks outside dreams? Who looks inside awakens." For me, this calling has never been a neatly wrapped mission statement. It isn't something I can print on a business card or summarize at a dinner party. It's more like a current beneath the surface of my life, pulling me forward even when I don't know where it leads. From childhood, I felt it, that restless awareness that I was meant for something beyond the ordinary rhythms of eat, sleep, work, repeat. I would sit under the stars and feel both small and enormous, insignificant and yet necessary, as though the universe were watching to see if I would respond to a summons only I could hear. Old age wisdom says, "He who has a why can bear almost any how." And I think that's what has carried me through dark seasons. Even when I couldn't name the purpose, I could feel it. And that feeling was enough to keep me moving. Here's a quirky fact. Migratory birds navigate thousands of miles using the Earth's magnetic field, a sense called magnetoreception. Scientists still don't fully understand how it works, but the birds trust it instinctively. That's how this undefined purpose feels to me, an inner compass aligned to a magnetic field others can't see. I may stumble, I may wander, but I can't escape the pull. Of course, there's a public debate around this. Some psychologists dismiss this sense of calling as fantasy, the ego's way of feeling special. Others argue that it's a defense mechanism, a way to cope with life's randomness by inventing meaning. Jung, however, saw it differently. He recognized it as evidence of the transcendent function, the psyche's innate drive toward wholeness and self-realization. For him, the feeling of purpose wasn't delusion. It was evolution, the psyche pointing us toward the next stage of consciousness. Living with this undefined purpose can be both exhilarating and torturous. Exhilarating because I never feel entirely trapped, there is always more ahead. Torturous because I rarely feel satisfied. The more I grow, the more the horizon recedes. People around me often ask, "Why can't you just be content?" And I wish I could explain that it's not discontent. It's momentum. My soul simply refuses to stay still. The hardest part is the loneliness of it. You can't always explain your calling to others. And when you try, it sounds vague, idealistic, even arrogant. So you carry it quietly, sometimes questioning your sanity, but then a moment comes, a conversation that feels fated, a synchronicity that defies logic, A creative burst that feels like it came from beyond you, and suddenly you remember the calling isn't imagined, it's real, and it's shaping you into someone you can't yet fully comprehend. This is the eighth sign of rarity, to live with a restless, undefined purpose that defies explanation but refuses to be silenced. It may never give you certainty, but it gives you direction. And in the end, perhaps direction matters more than destination. The ninth sign of rarity is moving through the stages of psychological development in a way that feels both accelerated and relentless. Jung called this process individuation, the unfolding of the psyche toward wholeness. For most people, individuation is a distant possibility, a vague stirring that may or may not surface in midlife. But for me, and perhaps for you, it has felt like the central storyline of existence. My life hasn't been about building comfort. Not really. It's been about peeling away illusions, stage after stage, until only something raw and undeniable remains. At first, I didn't recognize the stages for what they were. I only felt the tension of being different, the odd outsider who never quite fit in. That was the first stage, what I now call the unconscious outsider. I was full of sensitivity and awareness, but convinced it was all a problem to be fixed. I bent myself into shapes that pleased others, wore masks that earned me approval, and yet felt a gnawing emptiness no applause could cure. Old age wisdom says, better to be hated for who you are than loved for who you are not. But at that stage, I couldn't bear hatred, so I chose the counterfeit love of conformity. Here's a quirky fact. Caterpillars completely dissolve inside the chrysalis before becoming butterflies. They literally turn into a kind of cellular soup before reorganizing into something new. That's how stage 2 felt for me, the awakening individual. Everything I thought I knew dissolved. I could no longer hide from my shadows or silence my calling. It was messy, disorienting, and often terrifying. But it was also the first time I began to feel alive. Academically, this progression sparks debate. Some psychologists argue that Jung's individuation is too abstract, too mystical, a poetic metaphor rather than a practical reality. Others insist it's the foundation of all true psychological health. Jung himself believed it was the soul's deepest necessity, the reason behind all symptoms, the hidden aim of suffering, the meaning inside the chaos. For me, the evidence is simple. Once you start down this path, you cannot go back. Stage 3, the individuated consciousness, is still unfolding in me. It is the state where you weave your rare traits into a coherent whole, where you can carry both light and shadow without being torn apart. It is where solitude transforms from loneliness into sanctuary, and purpose becomes less of a question and more of a presence. It is where you begin to live not just as an individual, but as a bridge, helping others cross into their own authenticity simply by embodying your own. This ninth sign of rarity isn't glamorous. It doesn't make for a neat story. It means living through repeated cycles of death and rebirth, identity and disillusionment, shadow and integration. But it also means tasting a depth of wholeness that most never experience. And once you've felt that wholeness, however fleeting, nothing else will satisfy you again. The 10th sign of rarity is the constant confrontation with shadow patterns unique to people of depth. Jung warned that even the most advanced personalities are not immune to being sabotaged by their own unconscious. In fact, the rarer the psyche, the sharper the shadows that accompany it. I've seen this in myself too many times to count. The way brilliance can twist into blindness when shadow goes unacknowledged. The first of these is what I call the superiority shadow. It whispers that being rare means being better, that my depth justifies arrogance, that my vision makes me more evolved than those around me. For a while, this illusion even feels comforting. After all, when you've spent years being misunderstood, isn't it tempting to believe you're simply above it all? But old age wisdom reminds me, pride goes before a fall. And the fall always comes. Arrogance isolates. It blinds me to the lessons hidden in ordinary people and leaves me cut off from the very humanity I claim to honor. A second trap is the messianic shadow. It shows up in the urge to save everyone, to become the torchbearer, dragging the reluctant masses into the light. I've fallen into this countless times, pouring myself out until I was hollow, resenting those who didn't thank me, despairing when they slid back into their old patterns. But here's the quirky fact. Even Christ, the archetypal savior, spent nights in solitude, refusing to heal every person who came his way. If the archetypes themselves knew the limits of service, who am I to believe I can save the world without destroying myself? Then there is the martyrdom shadow. This one whispers that suffering is my destiny, that to be rare is to be perpetually wounded, that depth requires sacrifice of joy. It's seductive because it feels noble. But in truth, it's just another prison. Jung said, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. And complete acceptance means embracing not just the darkness, but the right to happiness, to ease, to ordinary delight. Academically, shadow integration is one of Jung's most debated legacies. Some argue it's too mystical. Others that it's indispensable for authentic growth. I've lived it enough to know unintegrated shadow will sabotage everything you built, recognized and accepted. It becomes the very foundation of strength. This 10th sign of rarity, then, is the lifelong negotiation with one's own shadows. It is learning that every gift has its distortion, every light its shadow, every truth its temptation. To walk this path is not to escape shadow, but to dance with it, to know its steps so well that it can no longer lead you astray. And that, perhaps, is the deepest rarity of all. The 11th sign of rarity is navigating relationships with an intensity that either electrifies or unsettles. Jung observed that rare personalities rarely experience neutral interactions. They either draw people who want to possess their light or people who feel threatened by it. For me, this pattern has repeated itself so often that I can almost predict the script before it begins. There are the light seekers. These are the ones who are drawn to me as if I'm a lantern in a storm. They sense the steadiness, the depth, the ability to see them more clearly than they see themselves. At first, it feels flattering, even sacred, but eventually, the weight becomes crushing. They don't just want to be in relationship with me, they want to live through me. They want me to be healer, confessor, therapist, anchor, and savior, and when I falter under the burden, they often turn bitter, accusing me of failing them. Old age wisdom whispers, you cannot pour from an empty cup. I've had to learn the hard way that intimacy cannot survive when one person becomes the vessel for another's wholeness. Then there are the light dimmers. These are the ones who sense my intensity and recoil. They tell me to tone it down, be more reasonable, stop thinking so much. They joke that I make everything complicated, but beneath the humor is discomfort. My authenticity forces them to see where they are living half-truths, and instead of rising, they try to shrink me. It hurts every time, not because I doubt my worth, but because it's painful to realize that what feels natural to me is threatening to someone else. Finally, there are the light matchers, the rarest of all. These are the ones who have done their own shadow work, who carry their own depth, who don't need me to be small or endlessly available. With them, connection feels like oxygen. There's reciprocity, a balance of giving and receiving, a mutual respect that doesn't require dimming or draining. These relationships are fewer, but they are the ones worth everything. Here's a quirky fact. Certain fireflies synchronize their flashes across entire forests, creating waves of light that move like a living constellation. They don't compete. They align. That's how it feels with light matchers, the rare few who don't just admire my glow, but join it with their own. The academic debate here is fascinating. Some argue that rare personalities are doomed to loneliness, unable to find true peers. Others insist that the scarcity of authentic relationships makes them infinitely more valuable when found. Jung leaned toward the latter. He saw the individuation process as something that ultimately allowed for deeper connection, but only with those capable of authenticity themselves. The 11th sign, then, is learning to discern, to know the difference between seekers, dimmers, and matchers, to love without becoming consumed, to shine without being diminished, and to hold out for the rare reciprocity that makes growth not just possible, but inevitable. The 12th sign of rarity is understanding that with psychological depth comes responsibility. Jung often wrote that those who carry unusual awareness are not gifted it for themselves alone. They are meant to serve as bridges between the unconscious and conscious realms of human life. For me, this truth has been both inspiring and heavy. Inspiring, because it gives meaning to the restless sense that my life must serve something beyond my personal comfort. Heavy, because it reminds me that my sensitivity and intensity are not toys, they are tools, and tools can either build or destroy. I remember times when I used my depth carelessly, dropping truths into conversations like bombs, watching others flinch at the impact. It took me years to learn that just because I see a truth doesn't mean it must be spoken, and certainly not spoken without care. Old age wisdom says, "A fool speaks because he has to say something. A wise man speaks because he has something to say." Rare personalities are tested constantly on that line. Will I use my insight to illuminate or to dominate? Here's a quirky fact. Lightning can reach temperatures 5 times hotter than the surface of the sun, yet it lasts only for a fraction of a second. That's what untempered insight feels like: brilliant, but destructive. Light that blinds rather than warms. The real task is to turn lightning into fire, something steady, useful, and sustaining. This responsibility becomes most pressing in moments of influence, whether in friendships, workplaces, or creative expressions. I've realized that people listen differently when you carry rare depth. Words land heavier. Silences echo louder. Presence alone can shift the atmosphere of a room. Jung described this as psychological holding space, the capacity to carry the unconscious material of others without collapsing under it. But holding space comes with a duty, not to exploit it, not to manipulate, but to honor it with care. The public debate around this is divided. Some argue that no one has an obligation to others simply because of their gifts. Others counter that depth without service becomes narcissism. Jung himself believed that individuation always culminates in contribution, not self-sacrifice, but a natural return to the collective once inner wholeness is achieved. The 12th sign, then, is recognizing that your rarity is not just personal, it is communal, evolutionary, even archetypal. You are a carrier of light in a world that often prefers darkness. And that means walking a fine line. Not savior, not martyr, not tyrant, but steward. The responsibility is daunting. Yes, but it is also the privilege of a lifetime. The 13th sign of rarity is recognizing the evolutionary significance of psychological depth. Jung believed that individuals who developed differentiated consciousness were not simply unusual, they were prototypes of what humanity could become. This idea has haunted me since I first encountered it, that the very qualities that have made me feel isolated and misunderstood might also be signals of an unfolding future. When I reflect on history, I see this pattern everywhere. The thinkers, artists, mystics, and innovators who pushed humanity forward were rarely the ones who blended easily into their societies. They were the ones accused of being too much, too intense, too different. They bore the loneliness of being ahead of their time. Old age wisdom puts it bluntly. The first person through the wall always gets bloody. And I've felt that bleeding of criticism, of rejection, of being called arrogant simply for refusing to shrink. Here's a quirky fact. When popcorn pops, it's not because of magic, but because of pressure. The moisture inside builds to the point that the kernel explodes into something entirely new. That is what it feels like to live as a rare personality, pressure building until transformation becomes unavoidable. Each rupture is painful, but it is also the very thing that allows new forms of being to emerge. Academically, Jung's prediction about psychological evolution is still debated. Some see it as overly idealistic, others as prophetic. He suggested that what is rare now may become normal in future generations, that the capacity for depth, sensitivity, and wholeness will spread as humanity matures. For me, the debate is almost irrelevant. I live the evidence. I see children born now with sensitivities I never had words for at their age. I watch cultural shifts inching toward valuing authenticity over conformity. I feel the current pulling us slowly, painfully, toward something more conscious. The 13th sign, then, is carrying the awareness that your struggles are not just personal, they are evolutionary. Your loneliness is a scouting mission into the future. Your refusal to settle is a blueprint for what will one day be ordinary. You are not just different for yourself. You are different on behalf of humanity. And that, if nothing else, makes the burden bearable. The 14th sign of rarity is learning to balance humility with power. Jung warned repeatedly about what he called psychological inflation, the danger that comes when someone identifies too much with the archetypal energies moving through them. I know this danger intimately. When you carry unusual insight, it's easy to start believing you are the insight itself. When people look to you for guidance, it's tempting to see yourself as the source rather than the channel. I've caught myself doing this more than once, mistaking the clarity that flows through me as proof that I'm somehow above others. Old age wisdom checks me every time. The higher the tree grows, the deeper its roots must reach. Without grounding, height becomes fragility. Without humility, power collapses in on itself. A quirky fact comes to mind. Astronauts returning from space often report what's called the overview effect, a profound sense of humility when seeing Earth from orbit. They describe awe not at their achievement, but at the fragility of the planet, the smallness of human conflict. That's the balance rare personalities must cultivate, the ability to hold immense perception without losing reverence for the ordinary. The academic debate here is sharp. Some argue that rare personalities inevitably slide into superiority, while others insist that true individuation always generates humility. Jung leaned toward the latter. He believed that genuine psychological growth revealed not how special one is, but how interconnected everything is. When I've been most inflated, I felt lonely. When I've been most humble, I felt connected. That alone is enough evidence for me. The 14th sign, then, is walking the tightrope between knowing your power and remembering your humanity. It is holding the paradox of being rare without being superior, gifted without being grandiose, luminous without casting others into shadow. True rarity does not scream its difference. It quietly embodies it, secure enough to need no applause, humble enough to serve without spectacle, wise enough to know that power without humility is just another form of blindness. The 15th sign of rarity is embracing your place as both mirror and catalyst. Jung believed that individuals of unusual psychological depth inevitably affect those around them, not by force, but by presence. I've seen this in my own life countless times. People either rise when they are near me, or they retreat. It is rarely neutral. I used to take this personally, believing that rejection meant I was unworthy, or that admiration meant I had to perform endlessly. Now I see it differently. I am simply a mirror. What others see in me is often a reflection of their own hidden potential or their unacknowledged shadow. Old age wisdom says, "The mirror shows what the face will not confess." And that is the gift and the burden of being rare. You reflect truths that others might prefer to avoid. Some respond with gratitude, others with resistance, and both are part of the process. Here's a quirky fact. Some butterflies have wings that reflect ultraviolet light patterns, invisible to the human eye but obvious to other butterflies. What we see as simple color is, in fact, layered communication. That's how presence feels when you've embraced your rarity. Others may not understand it consciously, but something in them recognizes it, responds to it, and sometimes even recoils from it. The academic discussion around this often focuses on projection. Jung described projection as the unconscious act of attributing one's own qualities onto another. Rare personalities often become the canvas for these projections, idolized as heroes, demonized as threats, misunderstood as enigmas. The work, Jung taught, is not to reject these projections, but to refuse to live inside them, to remain anchored in one's own authenticity, even while others paint their stories onto you. The 15th sign, then, is choosing to stand as a catalyst without needing to control the outcome, to offer presence without demanding recognition, to let go of the compulsion to be understood by everyone, and instead embody your truth so fully that those who are ready will find you. You become less concerned with convincing others and more devoted to living as evidence. Evidence that depth can survive in a shallow world, that sensitivity can endure without breaking, that authenticity can thrive even when misunderstood. And so the journey closes where it began, not with the ache of being too much, but with the quiet, knowing that rarity is neither curse nor crown. It is simply the shape of your being, and when lived fully, it becomes not a burden to carry, but a light to walk by. As we come to the end of this long journey together, let us soften the pace, ease the sharpness of ideas into something gentler, more spacious. You and I have wandered through the landscape of rare personalities, following Jung's footsteps into places that are both unsettling and luminous. We've explored signs of depth that many spend their lives trying to suppress, and we've seen how what looks like a burden in one light becomes a gift in another. The truth is, being rare is not about being better than anyone else. It is about carrying an inner architecture that does not let you rest in shallowness. It pulls you toward meaning, toward honesty, toward the kind of authenticity that cannot be faked. Yes, it is lonely at times. Yes, You will lose people who prefer the comfortable version of you to the whole one. But in that space of loss, new connections appear, the kind that honor your full depth without asking you to dim your light. Perhaps you've recognized yourself in some of these signs. Perhaps you felt the sting of being told you are too much, too intense, too different. If so, remember this: you were never too much for the world. The world was simply too little for you at the time. Jung understood that individuals like you are not accidents. You are the ones who stretch the edges of human possibility, who live as bridges between what is and what could be. So let the final images fade gently now. Imagine yourself walking with steadier steps, rooted in humility, yet carrying the quiet certainty of your own rarity. The world may not always understand you, but you are not here to be understood by everyone. You are here to be yourself completely, unapologetically, tenderly. That is enough. That has always been enough.